Well, good morning and welcome to Life Group. We're launching into our second part of our Romans series. If you were with us back in the spring, we covered Romans chapter 1 through chapter 7, and this semester we're going to cover chapters 8 through 16. But since it's been a bit since we covered Romans 1 through 7, I wanted to give a quick recap to help catch everybody up, remind you of what we covered, and then give a little bit of a preview of where we're headed. If you were with us in that study, you remember we talked about how the letter to the Romans was a letter Paul wrote to a church he had never been to. He didn't plant the church at Rome. He knew a lot of people who were in that church, but it was not part of his missionary journeys to plant that church. And so he longed to go see them, but had been prevented from seeing them. So he wrote this letter to help encourage them, to tell them about the faith that he had heard about them, testimony that he had heard from people that were traveling back and forth from Rome to him. But one of the things that had seemed to crop up in that church was a division between the Jewish believers and the Gentile believers in that church. And it's one of the big themes that Paul wrote in the letter. He had also had to bring up a topic about whether the gospel was the power of God for salvation. One of the interesting things about the gospel that was being encountered in the first century was how many Jews were rejecting it and how many Gentiles were accepting it. So these are two big themes that Paul had been discussing in Romans 1 through 7. Is the gospel really the power for salvation for all people? And what do we do about this ethnic divide that had been going on between Jewish and Gentile Christians? And so he launches in chapter 1 to this notion of how everybody has struggled with sin, everybody has fallen, and everybody needs Christ for salvation. He builds that theme from chapters 1 all the way through chapter 3 with that culminating verse in chapter 3, verse 23, that all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, that all are saved by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. And then he builds a doctrine of what that really means. So in chapters 4 and 5 and into chapter 6, he builds up this notion of what it meant to be a slave to sin, what it means to be in the lineage of Adam, and why Christ had to come, why it's true that even though Christ was Jewish and was a Jewish Messiah, he's really the Messiah for all people. And all need to come to him in faith in order to be set free from slavery to sin into a life of slavery to God, that we inherit Christ's righteousness. And so Paul focuses in really heavily on what it means that there is a righteousness that comes from God through Christ that we inherit by faith. And he's been building all of these themes. Part of this is to try to unite this schismatic church, this church that struggled between whether Jews are a different tier of believer than Gentiles, and what do we do about this difference of ethnicity. He wants to bring this whole church together in unity under an understanding of what it truly means to be in Christ. And then as he comes to the end of that first section in chapters 1 through 7, he begins a discussion about what it means to live into this life that Christ has given us. And so particularly at the end of chapter 7, he has this discussion with himself about who he wants to be and who he actually is on a day-to-day basis. And there's a struggle in Paul about what he sees himself doing and what he wants to be doing. And he says, "Wretched man that I am, who will set me free from this tension, this body of sin and death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ." And so he's built all of these theological points about how the law was always just a temporary placeholder until Christ came, that the Jewish nation, while privileged to be God's people, did not set them apart as different in terms of righteousness, that all need Christ, all have sinned, all need to come through faith in Christ to God. And he's built this entire theological foundation in order that he might launch into what we're going to be covering over the course of the next 8 weeks. And that is the notion of how all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purpose. What's going on with Israel? Why is it that so many Israelites are rejecting the gospel? Paul's going to explain in chapters 9 through 11 how to view that. And then in chapter 12, he's going to begin a discussion about what does it mean now that we understand where we were, how we're made righteous in Christ, how we're all united, how everyone's the same under Christ, all co-heirs with Christ. Now, how do we live? What does the church look like? What does individual Christian living look like? So that's what we're going to be covering over the next 8 weeks, is how should we view the power of the gospel? How should we view the way God is working with people in the world right now? And what should we do as believers, both individually and corporately as a church, in order to move forward? So I hope that you'll be with us the next 8 weeks. We're very excited about these lessons and look forward to seeing you all in Life Group. I'll turn it over to your leaders now.